Now, my topic for the elocution competition is something with which every Indian attaches a great deal of patriotic sentiment. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lex40 and I shall be presenting my views on the topic boycotting Chinese goods. Friends, the past few months have been very challenging for our country. The outbreak of the coronavirus, the consequent lockdown, the mass exodus of migrant laborers, and the tragic news of people committing suicides have been some things which have marked this phase. But the one thing which has moved every Indian alike is the Chinese incursions along our borders, coming at a time when the world in general and India in particular had highlighted about the importance of cooperation and co-action to convincingly defeat the COVID-19 virus. This particular sinister act exhibited the true nature of our neighbors, of territorial expansion, even in these times. Things took an ugly turn when 20 of our Indian soldiers were martyred by the People's Liberation Army when they went to reclaim our land, which the Chinese had mistakenly construed as to be falling in their jurisdiction. Thankfully, owing to the diplomatic efforts of the government and flexing of military might by our defense forces, things were resolved amicably and we now stand at status quo ante. This particular incident also made the average Indian consumer realize that it is in his demands that the Chinese for Chinese goods, demand for Chinese goods, that the Chinese government gets all the resources to equip its military. They realize the fact that the greater the demand for these Chinese goods, the greater is the prospect for the Chinese government to reap revenues and thereby use it to equip their military. Realizing this thing, they voluntarily gave up using Chinese goods and boycotted it wholeheartedly. Realizing this change in behavior, change in nationalistic mood, nationalistic sentiment, the government too imposed a ban on Chinese apps and cancelled all government contracts which had been given to various Chinese companies. And rightfully so, when the communist regime has itself stated that the mandate of the private Chinese companies working beyond its borders is to secure the interest of the motherland, read as working at the cost of the country in which they work for the Chinese governments. I think it was because of this particular reason. I think it was this realization on the part of countries like United Kingdom and the United States of America that they cancelled the rollout of 5G technologies, which was hitherto expected from a major Chinese telecom company. Equally, the government of India was equally justified in imposing countervailing duties on various Chinese goods, because for a country, for an economic powerhouse, for an economic superpower in Asia and known in the world, availing benefits under special provisions which are meant for developing and least developed countries, this did not go well with the trade practices around the world, and I think the government of India did well too in this regard by imposing several countervailing duties on Chinese goods. But having said so, I'm reminded of what Jeremy Bentham used to say of the greatest good for the greatest people. I think the times in which we find ourselves in, wherein the global supply chains have been severely restricted, we need to be very cautious of our every step. Going for a blanket ban or going for a trade war with China would not serve the purpose of making this great country into an economic superpower. Therefore, in my opinion, I think a phased withdrawal of our dependence on China to source our raw materials for goods, along with an equal emphasis on making India self-reliant in terms of indigenous production, is the need of the hour. I say so because also the many of our Indian unicorn companies, the major startups, have investments from the Chinese conglomerates, and any decision to limit investments would greatly jeopardize this prospect and hence make it difficult to realize the dream which we have seen of making India into a $5 trillion economy in some time. Thus, I would like to conclude by reminding the people that more than 100 years ago, a revolution started in the form of Swadeshi movement when British made goods were boycotted, and which eventually led to India's independence in the year 1947. We now stand again at that particular point where we have responsibility of our shoulders to make India a strong and an Atmanirbhar India. And if it has to start with boycotting Chinese goods, it needs to be done at any cost. Thank you and Jai Hind.